Tonight we have 6 monster-themed stories. Lately, I have been live streaming most of my recording sessions here on YouTube. All of these stories were recorded on stream, except for Story 2, which will be read by my good friend Swamp Dweller. Be sure to check out his channel if you haven't already. We have some really interesting ones for you tonight. I hope you guys enjoy them. A huge thank you to all of the authors for making this video possible. Remember, you can send in your own story to rylhstories@gmail.com. Likes and comments are always appreciated if you enjoy. Subscribing if you're new is of course as well. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. I want to share this story because someone might find it useful, but I share this information urging you to be extremely careful, and I beg you to never use it unless you find that you must. During my freshman year of college, I lost control, mostly due to freedom from my parents and a group of friends who were more interested in a good party than a good grade. I spent more time sleeping and drinking than I did in class or studying, but all of that changed when I woke up in the hospital bruised and covered in cuts. I was told I had been in a car accident the night before. I and 2 others were driving home from a party when the car crossed into the center divider, rolling several times and tossing all of us from the car. Miraculously, I escaped the crash with some scrapes and bruises, but mostly unharmed. The other guy in the car, Michael, broke his arm and got a bad concussion. However, the third occupant, a girl named Sam, was tossed in front of the rolling car and crushed underneath it. It took a rescue crew 4 hours to extricate her from underneath the crumpled mess of metal, and by the time they got to her, she was beyond saving. The police had no idea who was driving during the crash, and I couldn't remember anything about that night due to my state of impairment. Michael and I got stiff warnings about driving while intoxicated, or getting into a car with a drunk person. But other than that, we got off scot-free. My friends all said that Sam had been driving, and I was so messed up I couldn't even walk, let alone drive a car. Despite their reassurances, I was haunted by guilt and uncertainty. Had I been driving when we wrecked? Why did I survive? Was I responsible for her death? Every night I had nightmares of Sam calling for me from underneath her twisted metallic grave. I stopped leaving my dorm, stopped answering my phone, consumed by guilt and uncertainty. After a month of moping around my dorm, a friend of mine named Mark reached out. We talked for hours about my uncertainty and how I would never get answers. In response, he told me about the legend of the Skinwalkers house, a ramshackle green shack right off of Highway 380. Here a person could meet the ancient beings and make deals and bargain, including asking questions that otherwise could not be answered. At first, I was incredulous. I thought Mark was messing with me, trying to play a sick prank. But I was desperate to know, so I talked to some friends who had grown up on a nearby reservation. One of them put me in touch with a tribal elder named Richard, and after a few emails and lying about doing a research project, Richard told me about summoning a Skinwalker, which the Navajo call Naldushi. When we first spoke, Richard was hesitant to talk about the subject, but after repeated calls and a face-to-face meeting, Richard explained the ritual to summon a Skinwalker. As we finished our conversation, Richard warned me that when one makes a bargain with a witch, the witch always takes something in return. I will give you the same warning that Richard gave me. Skinwalker is not to be summoned or questioned on a whim. Please do not summon a Skinwalker unless you are ready to accept the consequences of your actions. If you decide to disregard my warning, you will need the pelt of coyote, 4 animal fat candles, a rosary that has been blessed by a priest, a liter of animal blood, and a crow's feather. Skinwalkers are most active right after sundown, when there is a storm coming in from the southeast. The house where you can meet them is between the mile marker 13 and 14. It's not hard to find. It took 3 months to find everything, and for the perfect weather system to arrive. Mark and I drove together to the house around 5, just as the sun began to sink underneath the Magdalenas. Shadows oozed from the dilapidated house, its putrid green paint peeling off of the bleached bones of wood. The house had no windows or doors remaining, and I could smell the mildew and rot from the road. Mark and I climbed through the barbed wire fence in front of the house and made our way in as storm clouds rolled in, bringing with them peals of angry thunder. As we stepped inside, The smell of old rotting wood overwhelmed me, and I fought the urge to vomit as we sat down on the stripped wooden floor. We spread out the coyote pelt with the head facing me, placing the greasy wax candles at the ends of its paws. We then placed the crow's feather in the mouth of the coyote pelt. After setting up the pelt and lighting the candles, Mark left the house and parked the car at a turnoff a mile up the road. When I was sure he was gone, I took the rosary in my hands and pulled hard, scattering the beads across the floor and pelt. I sat down at the head and took the goat's blood I had procured from a butcher and dumped it across the pelt, splattering myself and the ground in dark maroon splatters. The storm continued its steady progression across the desert, and the roar of thunder rumbled in my chest. I closed my eyes and focused on the sound of the storm willing the creature towards me. I was lost deep in my focus when I heard it. A wolf's howl mixed with the screams of a woman, a horrible cacophony of animal and man swirling together. I opened my eyes to see the house wreathed in fog. The supernatural mist surrounding the house but not permeating the structure itself. I heard a deep guttural chant coming from behind me as the creature approached the dilapidated wooden structure. Then came the footsteps. Heavy padding steps crunched against the gravel behind me, quickly followed by the creak of wood as it stepped into the house. Its hot breath stung at the back of my neck as it sniffed me before circling in front of me. It had taken the form of a huge gray wolf, far bigger than even myself. The legs were too long and spindly, the hide patchy and balding, and its ears were short and tattered. The Skinwalker sat across the pelt from me and stared at me, staring at me like I was a rabbit about to be devoured. Its eyes were unlike those of a wolf's, with dark brown iris, angry white sclera, and round pupils. Suddenly the wolf let out a pain yelp and began to shudder. The braying whimpers of the animal filled the house as the fur and skin began to slow off the creature. The flesh sizzled and popped like frying meat as the body began to disintegrate, quickly followed by the opening of the chest cavity as a woman crawled out of the quickly decomposing wolf carcass. She had Native American features with skin so wrinkled and scarred I couldn't even guess her age. Hair hung in black, stringy strands, and worst of all, her lips were stretched and mangled so that her mouth could never close fully. She wore a patchwork of skins and pelts and a pair of antlers atop her head. Even sitting, she was nearly a head taller than me. She locked eyes with me, inhuman, horizontal slits, like a goat's peering out from behind the mess of hair that hung around her face. Her voice croaked in her throat, and a harsh, guttural dialect spewed forth from her lips. My heart sank. How could I have been so stupid? Why would an ancient Navajo witch speak English? She must have noticed my disappointment, because she reached for a pouch on her belt and took out some sort of gray, waxy substance. She spread it on the tips of her index fingers, leaned forward, and jammed her fingers into my ears, her long, dirty fingernails scratching my ear canal. I yelled in pain and surprise at this intrusion, and she shifted her weight back into a sitting position. For a split second, my hearing faded before the sound of the storm surged back to life with a loud crack. The old woman locked eyes with me again, her face lit by the flickering candlelight. She spoke again, this time in English. "I've given you the gift of hearing. What is it you seek from I who goes on all fours?" Her voice low and raspy, like sandpaper on stone. My voice caught in my throat, my gut tightening at her words as I began to drift into a daze. I pushed my fingernails into the flesh of my palm until I could focus again. When I did answer, my voice was weak and uncertain. "I need to know if I killed her." She cackled, her voice spiraling to a crescendo until she sounded like a coyote baying at a frightened rabbit. "Very well, I can help you. But what have you brought for me?" My stomach twisted painfully again as fear clawed at the back of my mind. "I haven't brought anything to give you." "Very well. If you have nothing to give, then I must take. Do you agree to these terms?" I paused for a moment, considering what Richard had told me, but my guilt overwhelmed my rationale, and I shakily nodded my head in agreement at her terms. The Skinwalker smiled at this, revealing rows of miscellaneous teeth in her cavernous, distorted mouth. The teeth were inhuman, with sharp wolf-like canines mixed in with broad, flat teeth, like a horse, in a horrible conglomeration of stained rows of ivory shards. The laughter came again from her lips, horrible coyote cackling that made my skin crawl. After another round of laughter, she produced a crude stone knife from her belt, and with a quick motion ran it across the palm of her hand, spilling dark rivulets of blood onto the pelt before reaching towards me. I extended my hand and she dug the cruel stone into the soft flesh of my palm. My skin cried out in agony, and blood wept from the exposed flesh underneath. She clasped my bleeding hand with inhuman strength and pressed my wound against her own. Our blood mixed, and I felt it trickle down my arm and pool at the crook of my elbow. The woman began to chant and stared into my eyes as blood continued to flow freely down our arms onto the pelt beneath us. Her voice grew rough and animalistic as she continued her chanting. As suddenly as she had started, she stopped and let go of my now throbbing hand. Oh, how foolish you have been, just like your forefathers, with their drink and their endless cruelty. But her blood is on her own hands. Her foolish pride gave way to steel and glass. I have given you your answer, and now I will take two things from you. I take you from Nazel, your dreams. A wave of relief washed over me. I could live without dreams anymore. My dreams have been plagued with visions of Sam calling out for help from beneath the metallic tomb, begging for my help. With inhuman strength and speed, the Skinwalker grabbed my hand again and brought it to its mouth. I pulled hard against its grip and yelled to no avail as it pushed my thumb into its mouth. Hard teeth clamped down hard against the appendage, tearing away the flesh and bone of my thumb. Blood sprayed from the wound, painting a sanguine picture on its face. The creature chewed, and I could hear the crack of bone and the squelch of soft flesh in its teeth. I screamed in agony, clutching my hand and pressing the wound to my chest. My vision faded and blurred as I slumped to the floor. I wish I had gone unconscious. I wish I had closed my eyes. Instead, I watched as the Skinwalker tore at the flesh of its face, its long claw fingernails shredding through skin and muscle. The Skinwalker grabbed the skin on its arm and pulled, tearing it away from the muscle underneath, the flesh coming away like wet newspaper. I watched the muscles of its arm bulge and flex as it tore away the soft skin of its stomach, disemboweling itself. A gray coil of intestines lolled out of the abomination's abdomen, dragging against the rough wooden floor. It continued tearing away its flesh until only scraps remained on a skeletal frame. I willed my eyes to close, but they would not. I stared transfixed on the horrifying visage in front of me. The figure dropped to all fours and pulled one of the pelts it was wearing over its face. The pelt stretched and contorted, spreading over the skeletal limbs. The figure trembled and shook, twitching unnaturally. Then it began to grow, the limbs stretching and contorting, the chest becoming narrower. I watched as two sets of large antlers splintered out of the top of its head, stopping just before the ceiling. The figure continued to shift and contort, until finally, a massive bull elk stood in front of me. It strode out of the house, then paused and looked down at me. We locked eyes for just a moment before it let out a loud bugle and took off into the night. I pulled off my shirt and wrapped it tightly around my still bleeding hand. I staggered out of the house and glanced around, afraid the creature was waiting for me outside. There was nothing except for the rumble of thunder and the throbbing in my hand. I walked the mile to where Mark had parked the car, all the time pleading with my body to not bleed out. Mark paled when he saw me and rushed me to the hospital. I told the staff at the hospital that I had been messing with old farm equipment, a story they bought easily enough. In spite of everything that happened, I felt relieved with the knowledge that I hadn't killed Sam. The Skinwalker kept its word. It did take my dreams, because now I dream not about Sam, but instead about the Skinwalker. I dream of the Skinwalker changing and shifting. I watch time and time again as it tears apart animals for its dinner. The worst is when it attacks people, as I am forced to watch as it stalks hikers and campers. I watch as it disembowels them, mounts their bodies onto tree limbs, or skins them alive. I don't go into the woods anymore, for fear that I may see that thing again. But now and then as I drift off to sleep, I hear the sound of an elk bugle, followed by peals of coyote cackling.
My name is Brad, and this is a story about my family's and my own run-ins with a one-armed dogman that has become my greatest enemy. Well, let's get into the starting off. I am a well-seasoned hunter and an outdoorsman, and have been trained by Cherokee elders in many arts, mainly fighting, hunting, and knife techniques. But enough about me. Let's talk about how I lost an eye, and that bastard monster lost his right arm. Well, it was a morning like any other in the mountains of North Carolina. Cool, crisp, and damn well scary. To those who don't know these hills, I was heading to my best location for white-tailed deer, which is in an area called Wolf Ridge. Named so by my father, who had his own encounters with this beast, but that's another story. So, as I crested a ridge overlooking a stand of pines and sat down at the base of a large oak tree, then as I began to focus, the feeling hit me. There were no sound, no smells, nothing. In other words, something was definitely not right. After years of hunting these hills, my senses are fine-tuned, and that's when I heard the sound of the dripping and felt something hitting the brim of my hat. As I looked up, my blood ran cold, for above me, in the branches, was a large buck that had been torn to shreds. Seeing this, I knew that whatever killed this buck had to be close, as the blood was still fresh. I heard a sound snap right behind me in the brush. Thinking fast, I dropped to my knees just in the time to dodge the claws of this thing. But its charging bulk took me, and I rolled down the hill a short distance before jumping to my feet. I was met with the sight and sound of a beast from hell. Now, I believe my father, and now I know these things are called dogmen. 8 foot tall, 700 pound, upright werewolf. At the least, I was very outgunned and outclawed. I thought, crap, I'm dead for sure. Then something happened. My training took over, and it saved my life. Now, my rifle was leaned on the tree below the buck, and he was between me and it, so I pulled my tomahawk and knife. What happened next was, and is still hard to explain, but I'll try the best I can. This hulking beast charged me and clawed at my throat. Ducking in time, he only managed to blind me in my left eye. Time slowed, and I swung my blade up, severing his arm right below the elbow and jamming my tomahawk deep into his thigh. In that same moment, he howled in pain and fell to his knees, clutching his stump. The bastard will remember that. Where was I? Oh yes, as he glared at me with more hatred than Satan himself could bear, I reached the rifle, and man, did I let him have it. 4 rounds of 30-30 into his chest. Next thing I know, he is running down the hill at a speed I can't imagine, and I did the same, but in the opposite direction. I only stopped when I realized that I put a good distance between us. The pain. Oh god, the pain, it hit me and sent me to the ground, and that's when I realized my eye was destroyed. I got out of those woods with one less eye, and with my life though. I'm sure the beast is alive. I hear his howls more than often now, and I fear he may return for his arm, and quite possibly my life.
I've lived in the Vista Green apartments for about 4 years now, without much complaint. I pay my bills on time. I always make sure that rent is a week ahead, and that if I have any maintenance problems, I call the super that same day. I guess you could say that I fell into a routine. Everything became automatic. Grab the mail, punch the security code, nod politely to the neighbors. You just let one thing blend into another, and before you know it, weeks pass you by, then months, and then the years. Everything blurs together. I guess that's why when something out of the ordinary occurs, it's so jarring. It's like when you are driving along, and suddenly you wind up in a traffic jam. If you aren't careful, a situation like that can become a 10-car pileup. This is what happened to me just a few weeks ago. Recently, management made it clear that there were going to be several renovations made to the building. At first, I didn't think that it would affect me, but as I learned rather quickly, they wanted to start the work at the top and go down from there. Where exactly am I supposed to stay while this goes on? I remember asking the workers as they started moving my furniture around. It felt like my home was being invaded. This will take 12 hours, maybe 18. We'll be out here so fast, you won't even know that we were here. The head maintenance guy told me. So I called my girl Lisa and asked if she wanted to spend the day shopping. It was pointless to stand around and get an anxiety attack when I couldn't do a thing to stop them. "You're making a mountain out of a molehill, girl," Lisa told me once we were away from the apartment. "They stripped my floors and installed new lighting for me about a year back and didn't charge me a dime. It's one of the perks of living here," she explained. I couldn't argue with that. So I resolved to push it out of my mind for the rest of the day. It worked. By the time I was telling Lisa goodnight and getting into the elevator, I had completely forgotten about the maintenance men. That changed when I stepped out on my floor and I saw something leaking out from underneath my apartment door. It looked like smoke, low rolling clouds of gray smoke that were pushing out of the penthouse. Immediately I ran and unlocked the door, thinking my entire place had somehow burst into flame. I used my scarf to cover my mouth and then gently pushed the door open. Instead, as I entered, I found that the same strange gray smoke was wafting about on the floor of the den in the first hall, but nothing had been disturbed until I reached the kitchen. That was where I found the first body. One of the maintenance men was laying against the cold tile floor, either passed out or worse, and another was right across from him. Keeping my mouth covered, I went back to the hall and cranked up the AC, hoping to make the smoke escape my apartment via the vents. As it cleared, another mystery unfolded. In between the bodies of the two workers, I saw what appeared to be a trapdoor hidden beneath the tile. From the tools that were lying nearby, it was clear that these men had been working to pry apart the tile and get to the door. The door itself looked old, like the kind you might find on a tornado shelter, and then I noticed that they had in fact succeeded in shimmying it open, because that was where the strange gray smoke was coming from. Slowly I opened the trapdoor all the way, trying to get a good look at what might lay below, but instead, all I saw was a ladder that plummeted into darkness. Aside from the ladder, the only thing visible in the tunnel was the smoke. It kept rolling out over top the still bodies of the men, and watching it slither about my apartment made me more nervous than I already was. My first idea was to call the super, but then I remembered how late it was. She'll already be gone for the night. My second idea was much smarter, but I figured if anyone had an idea of what to do, it would be Lisa. She made it to my apartment in 10 minutes, and I offered her a small flu mask to keep from inhaling the smoke as she came inside. "This stuff is giving me a headache," she moaned, as she checked out the rest of the apartment first, and then focused on the two dead men in my kitchen. "Jesus Christ. Chris, why haven't you called the police yet?" she asked. "I don't know. I didn't know what to do," I admitted, as she leaned down to examine the trapdoor. "Where the hell does this lead?" she asked, looking down the hole. I stood alongside her, nervously biting my nails and wondering the same thing. There's no way this goes to the floor below. There's probably only like 15 feet between us and them, Lisa said, as she took off her heels and started to get in the hole. "What are you doing?" I asked. "There's only one way to get to the bottom of this," she quipped. I watched as she descended into the darkness until she was gone from sight. Then I waited. It felt like forever, and finally I got nervous and called down to her. "Lisa, can you hear me? What did you find?" I asked. The worst response I got was none at all. The tunnel was quiet. I tried to shine a light down there too and see how far it went, but the illumination didn't travel very far. And then just as I was trying to figure out what to do next, my foot touched one of the maintenance men's shoulders, and suddenly his body disintegrated like dust. I stifled a scream as I watched it collapse into itself, the way a sandcastle would. Then I turned to the other man and wondered if the same thing would happen to him if I bumped him. I gently reached toward his arm to give it a squeeze. Then his skin faded into ash as well. I stood there, confused and scared for the longest time, trying to figure out what had just happened. Then I watched in stunned silence as the fog I had seen from earlier slowly covered the remnants of their body, as if it was swallowing up the particles that were left. And then it seemed to slither back into the hole where it had come from. In a matter of minutes, my apartment was clear of the gray smoke, and I was standing alone, staring down at the pit. I probably stood there for the longest time, looking down at the tunnel and hoping Lisa would come back. But eventually, I convinced myself to close the door and to cover up the hole. I checked into a hotel for the night and got as drunk as possible, trying to forget about the hole and the mysterious fog. The next day, I went to the super to explain what had happened to his 2 maintenance guys, but he acted like I was the crazy one. "Why are you looking at me like that?" I asked angrily. Then to my surprise, behind me, the 2 men I had seen turn into ash stepped into the office and nodded politely towards me. I felt this odd coldness about them when they were talking to me. "We were going to start the renovations next week, but something came up. You needn't worry about us bothering you anymore, ma'am," one of the men said. It felt like my eyes were playing tricks on me, but I didn't want to look like a crazy woman, so I thanked them for their time and left. As I was crossing the lobby, another familiar face stopped me dead in my tracks. "Lisa, thank goodness you're alright," I said as I ran up to give her a hug. But if the maintenance men had acted cold, then the way she was treating me was like hell had frozen over. "Chris, is everything okay?" she asked me with a sneer as she stepped away from me. My mouth felt dry. Was this some kind of prank? "What do you mean, am I okay? Are you okay? You were in my apartment yesterday. You went into that strange tunnel. Don't you remember?" I asked anxiously. She responded by stepping onto the elevator and shaking her head as if I was babbling nonsense. "You must have had one too many last night. I think I would remember something like that." She chuckled. I was speechless until I made it to my apartment, and the confusion got worse when I checked my kitchen, and I found no indication that the maintenance workers had ever even disturbed the room. Had it all been in my head? I tried my best to stop thinking about it, but this time I couldn't simply shrug it off. I found the few tools I had in my emergency kit and went to the kitchen to see for myself. Gradually I pried the tile up, trying to see what was underneath. It didn't take long. It was just solid. No tunnel, no trapdoor. Maybe it had all been a dream. But for some reason, I felt the need to dig deeper. I pushed down against the floor and brushed off what I thought was dirt to see the outline of the door, and my heart stopped. Then with renewed vigor, I pushed on through until I could easily open it again. Just like before, the ladder sank into the darkness. I called Lisa immediately, desperate for some kind of sane explanation. She rushed to my apartment and examined the tunnel, a perplexed look on her face. "Now, that is quite strange, Chris, but I don't see the big deal," she commented as she walked around the other side and asked, "Have you gone down there to check it out?" "You went down yesterday and don't even remember a thing." I sputtered. "I'm fine, so you should be fine too. We could go down together if you want," she replied. Something in her tone sounded wrong, not like the Lisa I knew. It made my skin tingle, and I stepped away from her. "What I'm going to do is call the authorities. Someone needs to know about this," I said. Abruptly, my friend leapt toward me, grabbing my phone and tossing it across the room. "You've always been so stubborn. Why don't you just go down the ladder?" she snarled as she pushed me to the floor. I had the wind knocked out of me, frightened and confused as she grabbed at my hair and tried to drag me toward the pit. Lisa, what's gotten into you?" I screamed as I pushed my fingers into her face and tried to break free. Lisa, or whatever this was now, controlling her body, hissed at me like a poisonous cobra. She snagged her nails in my hair and slammed my head against the tile. I switched to survival mode and fought as hard as I could to overcome her, pushing her toward the pit. I knew from her feral spirit that it was going to be either me or her. With all of my strength, I pushed her straight to the edge of the pit. She lost her footing and fell, straight into the hole. Lisa screamed and I watched as she plummeted, her voice echoing for nearly 10 minutes until it was just a distant blur. I remember thinking I had just killed my best friend, and I fell to my knees, broken and defeated. It took all I could do to remember that this thing couldn't have been Lisa. Whatever was in this tunnel had changed her. What was down there? I had to know. Something inside me stirred me to know, but this time, it would need to be me that went down there to find the answers. I'm going down now, and I'll update when I get back. Maybe take a few pictures of what I find along the way. Wish me luck. Update. I was mistaken. There's nothing here. There never was. I know you probably don't believe that, given everything I've said prior to this, but it's the truth. Don't believe me? Maybe you should come see for yourself. Throughout all of human history, there has been one constant throughout the variables of civilization's advancement: stories. As mankind moved away from the small clay huts to monolithic steel skyscrapers, the yearning to tell and listen to stories has always been persistent. It's a way of not only growing and evolving the mind, it's a way of connecting with one another. Yet, out of all the methods of storytelling that have evolved from the small carvings of stick figures along Neolithic walls, there's one in particular that seems to strike a nerve more than any other: legends of horror. From the very moment you learn to tuck your children into bed, or gather around in communion by a fire, stories of dark and terrifying creatures have invaded your nightmares through the catalyst of scary stories. Many of these classics have become so immovable in human culture that they've transformed from their mere tales of horror to urban legends. Out of the plethora of dark tales told in the night, there's one that holds a certain interest close to my heart: the tales of a mysterious interloper that plays a mesmerizing tune from his pipe to lure unsuspecting children to their doom in the forest brings a certain interest to me. Not because of how it can scare the shit out of a misfit to try and get them to behave, it's because it's about me. Yes, I know. I know what you must be thinking. What the hell is this guy talking about? Well, let me explain. First of all, for those of you who are unaware of the tale of the Pied Piper, let me give you a small rundown. Originating from Germany, the legend tells of a town overrun with rats. The rodents feast on the town's produce and spread death and disease. Eventually the town tries to hire a mysterious rat wrangler. Out of desperation, the wrangler plays his music pipe, causing all the rats of the town to drown themselves in the sewers and wells of the town. Upon receiving no payment for his services, the piper begins to play a tune late at night, causing all the children of the town to get out of bed and head for the river. It is then that, one by one, each child walks into said river, drowning themselves. Pretty messed up, right? That's because it's wrong. The legends have been misconstrued through a game of urban telephone lasting generations. Well, that's why I'm here, to set the record straight. So here we go. The Legend of the Pied Piper, written by yours truly. Once upon a time in the mystical land of Germany, there lived a being of the earth. This being was strong and intelligent, and had just as many hopes and aspirations as man. Yet he was not a man. He knew many things about himself, except where he came from. The being spent many long years in the forests, educating himself about the world around him, as well as its inhabitants. During the day he would spend time with his friends, who were the fellow inhabitants of the forest floor. At night he would take his musical pipe fashioned from the pipe of the trees around him, and play. Music was like a drug for the piper. He knew many songs, of which he would play a new tune every night. Once every so often, the piper would play one song through his instrument he knew all too well, the song of hunger. Unlike the rest, this song would reach far and wide in the land around him, yet only one other would ever hear it. This other would be a child, just one, no more, no less. As the music would play, the child would go off wandering away from home into the forest. Almost every encounter between the children and the piper would be the same. The entranced child would walk into the woods smiling a cleaning smile. As they came to the source of the wonderful tune, they would look up and see the piper perched along one of the tree branches up above. "Are you the one who plays such lovely music?" the child would ask. It would be then that the music would stop. Almost immediately after silence returned to the forest, the child would look around in complete adolescent confusion, having absolutely no idea where they were, or how they got there. They would look up at the piper and ask how to get home. "Home?" the piper would ask, hopping down from his tree branch. "My sweet, delectable child, you are not going home." For a short time afterward, the piper approached the child. The quiet forest would be filled with the screams of pain and anguish, as the child would be feasted upon by the piper, tendon by tendon, limb by limb, bone by bone. The piper would consume and leave nothing to waste. But out of everything consumed, the fear and pain of the child would fill the pipe's belly more than anything. It would strengthen his essence with every scream and cry for mercy, to which there would be none. Once the meal was finished, the piper would dig far below for a short while and sleep. Every so often he would awaken for a season and play music, engage with his friends of the forest, and consume a meal. Then he would return back to the ground for another short time, to sleep once again. On one particular awakening, however, he was not greeted to surrounding trees as he crept forth from the ground, but by houses and streets of stone. The wonderful forest he had known all his life had become the town of Hamlin. The piper was disgusted by what man had done to his home. However, peering through his anger was curiosity. He would roam the streets of Hamlin, seeing its many inhabitants, while also searching for any remnants of his old home. Eventually he came to the river of Hamlin and was filled with delight. The same water that had run through the forest floor still flowed through the grounds surrounding the town, but all of the adventuring had done the piper in. His belly was grumbling, he was hungry, but the piper knew he could not walk into the town of Hamlin and take a child just because of his appetite. That was rude, and while man may have been rude, he was not, but he was angry. Angry at the perversion that man had done to his home. So he sat on the outer banks behind the town of Hamlin in the dark of the night. He smiled as a plan arose in his mind. The next morning, dawn arose over a Hamlin under siege by hordes of rats. The rodents themselves had arrived by another one of the piper's talented songs. Day by day, for weeks the people of Hamlin would try to stomp and smash all the rats, but to no avail. All hope for the little town had seemed lost, until one day, the piper came strolling through the streets to the mayor's home. The mayor was weary and tired from the troubling invasion of rats, but was overjoyed when the piper offered a solution. For sufficient payment, I shall find your streets of the rodent infestation. The piper said with a smile, "Oh, but of course, anything for someone who could save our troubled town," exclaimed the mayor. That day, the piper walked out into the streets of Hamlin and played another tune on his pipe. The music carried over all of the rats of the town, as they safely evacuated the town, just as they had appeared. The townspeople rejoiced and clapped as their filthy streets were clean of rodents once again. Upon the completion of his work, the piper returned to the mayor for adequate compensation for his work. "How much coin for your service?" asked the mayor of Hamlin. "None," replied the piper. For a moment the mayor was confused, until the piper continued, "I only ask for your child." The piper said with a smile on his face and a deeper grumbling in his belly. With a face of rage and disgust, the mayor threw the piper out of his home as the people of Hamlin beat and bruised him till he left their town. It was here that the piper had been changed forever. For the first time in his entire life, he looked back at the distant town of Hamlin with revenge in his eyes. That night, the piper's song of hunger filled the air of Hamlin and lifted each dreaming child of the town out of their bed. In the midst of twilight, the children murdered their parents in their sleep, the perfect betrayal as repentance for their betrayal of the piper. Covered in blood, the children walked down the streets of Hamlin, carried by the soothing song of the piper. As they came to the river outside of the town, one by one, the children walked into the river. By dawn, every single child of the town floated in the bloody river of Hamlin, except for one, the son of the mayor, the piper's payment. There and then, the piper feasted once again, next to the river, filled with the true pests of Hamlin. The child's screams carried far in the crisp morning air, yet there was no one left to hear it. With his belly full and the town emptied, the piper dug himself a place in the ground to sleep once again for a short while, and unlike the wretched people of Hamlin, the piper lived happily ever after. There we go. That's a nice story, isn't it? Even nicer that the whole thing is fixed. Of course I hate that it took so many centuries for the director's cut of this story to even come to light, but I've been asleep for so long, and I have to say, I'm quite impressed with the way the world has progressed in terms of technology and architecture, but I'm quite disgusted by the further perversion of this once green world. But at the end of the day, what can one lonesome piper do in a world so vast and alien to him now? Well, I suppose we'll both find out together now, won't we? Well, I better go on and get off of here. I'm getting hungry, and my pipe has been quiet for long enough. So I'll start off by saying that I love camping. It's my hobby that I do every weekend to clear my mind. But the thing is that I'm not your usual camper. Like, I don't go to spots that everyone knows about. I go to the deepest, most secluded parts of the forest that most people consider not reachable, and I'm usually going alone. This time was not very different than most of my camping trips. I hopped in my old Ford Ranger, which usually had some trouble starting up. Traveled a couple of hours into the pine forest until I reached a very suspicious looking dirt road. The thing is, I like suspicious looking dirt roads. They usually take you to the best camping spots. I got onto it. It was very unkept. Looked like a car hadn't driven on it in at least a year, but my old truck didn't have any trouble driving on it. I drove for what seemed like an hour until the road ended on a small clearing. I parked my truck and got out to look around. I realized that I am in the middle of nowhere, which, oddly enough, was a good thing for me. I got all my gear with me and started walking towards the woods. When I reached the tree line, an odd feeling of uneasiness descended upon me. Like when you're alone in the house and suddenly the power of the whole neighborhood cuts off and you feel like something is about to come and rip you to pieces. Or is it just me? Anyway, I thought a little, but I ignored it as the usual forest creepiness. I started walking deep into the forest, and as I say deep, I mean deep. Like walking a couple of hours through fallen trees, big rocks, hills, and anything related. Finally, I found a small stream. And by small I mean like 9 feet wide and 5 feet at most deep. It had a small clearing on the edge, and I decided this was my home for the next 3 days. I set up my tent and got a small fire going. By this time it was 4:30 p.m. and the sun was starting to set, but it was quite dark since the trees covered most of the sunlight anyway. I decided it was the perfect time to sit down, crack a beer that I left to cool in the river earlier, and relax. By 8 p.m. I started getting very sleepy. I gathered my stuff, collected all the trash and leftovers, put them in a bag, and hung them on a tree some 100 feet away to keep the bears away from my camp. I got in my tent and quickly fell asleep. I had a dream that night. I was at the tree line where I parked my car. I felt that feeling of uneasiness again, but this time it was different. It was stronger. As I was about to start walking into the forest, I heard a strange noise, like a stick breaking from heavy weight, but hollower. I turned to the source of the sound to see a tall, skinny shadow standing 100 feet away on the other side of the clearing, just at the tree line behind some bushes, which it was towering by at least 12 feet. Of course I got scared, turned around and tried to run, but you know how dreams are. My feet just couldn't get any grip to the ground, like some invisible force was holding me back. I turned around to see the shadow was now slowly walking towards me and making a crack with every step. When I saw that, sheer terror descended upon me. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them, I was in my tent again, sitting and breathing heavily. Weird, I thought, as I didn't remember waking up. My rationality got the better of me. After all, it was just a dream, right? People sometimes don't remember waking up from terrible dreams, right? Anyway, it was around 9 a.m. and I proceeded with my daily duties, which consisted of looking around the camp for any trails from wild animals, gather some wood for the night, and checking the trash bag that I hung from the tree. I started by collecting some wood from the surrounding forest, then checked for any trails and didn't find any, until I headed for the trash bag. When I got to the tree that it should have been hanging from, nothing. And by that I mean absolutely nothing. No bag, no trash. My first thought was bears, but no. As far as I'm aware, bears don't eat beer cans and plastic bags, right? I looked around for any signs of wildlife, but nothing. Except some weird small holes in the ground. They looked like someone took a big sharp stick and stabbed it into the ground. The weirder thing is that they were spaced like footsteps. My thought was maybe another camper, but that didn't seem rational. Like, who would come that far into the forest in the middle of the night just to steal my trash bag? Anyway, I followed the footsteps. They circled a couple times around my camp, which was creepy enough, but then they headed straight into the river. These footsteps, if you could call them that, didn't resemble the trails of any animal that I know of. I got creeped out and didn't follow them any farther. Some time passed. It was now around 2 p.m., and I decided that a short swim in the cold stream wasn't a bad idea, and I smelled like sweat anyway. I got my bathing suit on and headed straight to the river. I jumped in the cold water and immediately felt refreshed and cleansed. I swam around and jumped in the water for a little while. Then it hit me. The footsteps. Maybe I should go back and try to follow them again. I got to where they entered the river, checked around for where they should have exited the water, and after about 15 minutes of searching in the cool water, I started to feel quite cold. And right as I was about to head back for my camp, I saw them. There they were, the same weird holes in the ground, on the other side of the riverbed. I got out of the river and started following them again. About 50 feet in, I noticed that the footsteps suddenly come to a complete stop. I look around to find more, but no luck. It's like the person, or should I say, the thing that left them, suddenly just disappeared into thin air. I got creeped out and decided to just leave whatever left those weird holes alone. I got back to my camp. I dried myself, ate some canned beans, got a decent fire going, and drank a beer while relaxing around the campfire. By this time it was 5 p.m. and the sun had already set, covered by the thick pine forest. Time for relaxation, I thought. 2 hours in, and I started feeling sleepy again. That is until I heard it. The hollow noise of a stick being broken that I had heard in my dream last night. Shivers ran down my spine, and a sudden feeling of dread filled my whole body. A bear? I thought. But no. There was no trash bag that could attract it this time, and the sound was coming from the total opposite way, from where those footsteps ended. And then again, crack, crack, like someone was walking in a big hallway with cheaply made wooden heels that broke with every step. I turned around. There it was, on the other side of the riverbed, that skinny and tall shadow, illuminated only by the moonlight. It was just standing there, observing me. I just stared at it with horror as my mind was racing with thoughts of what to do. Then it hit me. I always carry a gun on my camping trips. I jumped out of my resting spot, running straight for my tent to get my 30-08 Winchester bolt-action rifle. As I reached the tent, I unzipped it, opened the little door, and the second I entered it, everything got black for literally a part of a second. It was like when you suddenly stand up and your peripheral vision goes dark. And there I was, laying next to the campfire, which had already stopped burning. I noticed it was starting to get bright outside. I checked my clock and 7 a.m.? How was that possible? I was just in front of the tent. Did I fall asleep and not notice? Was I that sleepy last night? I had so many thoughts running through my head at that moment. A couple of minutes passed and I shook it off as another dream. Weird, very realistic and scary dream. But still just a dream, right? I started going for my daily duties just like the previous day. I checked for wildlife trails, I gathered wood, I checked the trash bag, and then... What? The trash bag? I didn't leave a trash bag last night, didn't I? But there it was, hanging from the same tree. Was I going crazy? Losing my mind? Or is there someone that's playing tricks on me? I stood there for a second and thought about it. A sudden blast of courage got over me. I got my gun from my tent, loaded it, and headed to where I last saw the creature last night. I crossed the river looking around for the footsteps. It wasn't hard to find them. They were right where I last saw the creature last night. I followed them, pointing my gun at every sound I heard. I walked for around 10 minutes until I came across another clearing in the middle of the forest. I looked around for more footsteps, but there weren't any. And then it hit me again. The last two footsteps were a bit deeper than the previous ones. That means the creature didn't vanish. It jumped. I immediately looked up in the trees above me. Nothing. I looked around the clearing. Still nothing. Then I checked the top of the trees. There it was, on the other side of the clearing, right in front of me, some 250 feet away. It was just standing there, at the very top of the pine trees, staring at me, observing. I pointed my gun straight at it, then squeezed the trigger, and right as the gun fired, the thing, it just jumped off the top of another tree, before the bullet could even hit it. Then on another tree, and another, and another, still making that stupid cracking sound with every jump. It was getting closer to me, and then I just ran, straight to my camp. When I was in front of my tent, I couldn't hear the cracking anymore, but still pure fear was all over me. I grabbed the most important things from my camp, like my phone, wallet, and some more ammo for the gun in case I needed it later. I then ran straight for my car, but deep inside me, I knew that my car was at least a 3-hour walk from my camp, but that didn't deter me. I ran as fast as I could, as far as I could, Of course my body couldn't keep up with all that running, but my mind was stronger. When I couldn't run, I speed walked. I just couldn't stop moving. I was so scared even when I hadn't heard a sound in about an hour, which was kinda eerie on its own, but I didn't care. I just had to move as fast as I could. About 3/4 of the whole distance, I just couldn't run or even walk in that matter. I needed to rest, even if my mind didn't want to. My body couldn't keep up with it. I stopped behind a fallen tree and sat down for a second. I was sitting there for no more than 3 minutes. Then I heard it, that cracking sound. I was filled with terror and immediately started running again. Even my body wasn't ready for it. Finally, after what felt like days of running, I saw the clearing where my car was parked in the distance. I felt relieved, but not for long. As I got closer to the car, I heard the cracking again. This time it was very close, like 100 feet away at most. I really thought this was the end for me. That thing, whatever it was about to get me. And just as I accepted my fate, I slammed into my car's door. I was so buried in thoughts that I didn't even realize I was right in front of my car. Immediately, I unlocked my car and entered it. I tried to breathe for literally a second, but immediately got shoved back to reality. That thing was still cracking its way towards me. I put my keys into the ignition, turned them, and nothing. Not even a click. Battery. It used to disconnect very easily on bumpy roads. That meant I had to get out there, open the hood, and connect the battery. After a minute, I had barely gathered the courage, and I pulled the knob, got out, opened the hood, fidgeted around with the battery, and finally got it connected. I ran straight back into the car, locked all the doors, and tried to start it again. I turned the key. This time the starter rotated, but the car didn't start. I tried again, and still the same. Just when I was about to lose all hope, I turned the key a third time, and bam, the stupid old truck started right up. I peeled out of there all the hours back to my house, while still hearing that stupid cracking noise echoing through my mind, never to be forgotten. Since then, I haven't gotten that far into the woods, and certainly don't go camping alone. Was that thing trying to make me go mad by moving the trash bag, appearing right in front of me, and make it seem like I dreamt it, so it can take me easily? Those are some questions that will probably never get an answer. No one believes me. I don't know even if I believe myself anymore. Maybe I'm just really going crazy. Guys, if you have any idea what that thing was, please inform me. And remember, never go too far out into the woods, especially alone. I stared at the white lines painted on the asphalt of the parking lot. I couldn't look up. That image would have been seared into my brain forever if I did. A helpless, grief-stricken father standing on the tailgate of his truck, thanking those of us who had gathered to help search for his missing son. I'd never met the kid, but people said he was cordial and funny, a shooting guard on the basketball team who liked to eat everything with hot sauce. Typical teenager, with a handful of close friends who drifted in and out of classes on the weekdays and enjoyed video games and pot on the weekends, I'm sure. However, I did know his dad from a few construction sites I'd worked through the years, and I thought it was the least I could do to help search the community for the one he'd lost. I could see a young woman whose cheeks were flushed and tear-drenched, sobbing between two other young women who had their eyes closed and heads bowed. I assumed that the emotional one must have been the girlfriend. I went back to my white line. I felt bad for her. It was a shame to experience loss so early in life, right when the confusion of adolescence was waning, sinking back into its hole of immaturity, and replaced with the optimism and adventure of the future. Behind the trio of women were a handful of young men, athletic and tall, that were stone-faced and swaying to an unknown rhythm as the father spoke. The local basketball team, I assumed. The one missing their star shooting guard. Behind me were the other 36 willing participants of the search party, relatives from out of town, friends, church members, neighbors, all collected together in a grocery store parking lot, waiting for instructions. Still, I couldn't look up, even when the father distributed Google Map printouts that had sections gridded with a marker. to signify inspection zones. Being one of the oldest in the group, I was rewarded with the longest drive. After a swift head nod to the father, I took my printout and drove to my assigned zone in the southern part of town. Our town was small, a population of only 10,000 people, so it only took 2 songs worth of driving before I reached my destination. I parked my truck on the berm of the road and traced my finger along the printed map to judge the best starting point for my survey. Also printed on the map, displayed in a colored block, was the clothing the teenager was last seen wearing. An aqua blue hoodie, black jeans, gray Converse sneakers, and a yellow bracelet given to him by his mother before she died of cancer 3 years earlier. Soon, a handful of trucks had parked behind mine, with people exiting the cabins and chatting and stretching and lumbering toward the overgrown pasture. But by that time, I was halfway up the hill that loomed over the grassy area. I waved, but none of the other search party members saw me, as they were busy arguing about the humidity and craning their necks to examine the weeds. I turned around and continued my exploration. The grass was knee-high, waist-high in some spots, and the morning dew had not yet evaporated. My jeans were already moist, and my legs began to chafe from my high-stepping gait. Thick woods were adjacent to the pasture, and I revisited my map to find hand-drawn lines crossing into the threshold of the dark green splotches that stretched off the page. I cussed under my breath and trudged in the direction of the sprawling pine forest. On the edge of the woodline was bramble so thick I deemed it impenetrable at first glance. I moseyed along the first row of pines, mostly saplings, and kicked the drifts of litterfall that had accumulated over a decade of rainwash. My face was trained downward, searching for a spot of bright blue or a sliver of yellow in the dull colors of the forest floor. Only then did I see the game trail that pierced the twisted fortress of bushes and vines that led into the mouth of the pine woods. I followed it, the occasional whispers of conversation from the members of the search party muffled. When I entered the woods, then grew silent altogether. The ground was forgiving to my aged joints because of the dead pine straw and decaying limbs that covered the area like a soft blanket. A few rolling hills, but nothing too burdensome to handle. Undulated under the towering pines, and where the hills merged was a meandering creek that cleaved an artery through the woodland. I leapt the ditch and ascended one hill, stopped to get a breather, descended, leapt another ditch, and began to climb again when I froze. A vibrant blue caught my attention. My eyes and brain strained to make sense of what I witnessed. A young man, stuck in a perpetual grimace, was watching me amid the fallen leaves on the ridge of the next hill. His eyes were open but clearly not operational. He lay in the prone position, and his lower body hid behind the opposite side of the hill, but I could see his arms, splayed out in front like someone sitting down for a nap. A shock of black hair flowed to one side, allowing me to see the vivid colors of the hoodie that covered the torso. There was no movement. Understandably shocked, I couldn't move at first. In all honesty, I never thought I would actually find the missing teenager, but there I was, agape and gazing stupidly at the depraved treasure of this hunt. Deep down, I knew eventually I must look into the eyes of the father and tell him the horrific news. His son had been found, but not alive. I fought the sourness in my gut and scaled the hill, leaving a faint gully of pine straw in my wake and doing my best not to slip. Then something happened. The teenager began to move. He teetered to one side, then his head lolled down before he slipped down the hill and out of my view. More curious than upset, I tackled the remaining space as quickly as I could and, once I topped the hill, supporting myself on a trunk to regain my breath, my head was on a swivel, glancing around the area for the dead, moving teenager. I followed the trail of agitated litterfall, stepping as quickly and quietly as possible, but the trail ended in the hollowed route of the creek. I glanced up at the trickling stream and saw a sliver of yellow flee behind a bend that was covered in a cluster of bushes. I sprinted along the ledge in pursuit. In an instant, I was in full view of the teenager's body, running water flapping over his pallid skin, hoodie piled high to his neck, arms dangling loosely at his sides under the mercy of the watery flow, his lifeless eyes gawking at the heavens. He was slipping, feet first, into a hole situated in the bank's edge. I was baffled at how this would happen, since there was no leverage from his arms. A clawed hand sprouted from the hole, and took the teenager's shoulder, then drew the body deeper into the pit. Through the darkness, something furred and sinewy emerged. A creature wedged its weight against its discovery, pulling and straining until the body was completely shrouded in the black depths of its den. The last I saw of the body was his trailing wrist, wrapped in a thin yellow bracelet. Steel gray eyes found me. The scavenger slunk low and growled, its expanded jowls vibrating and swelling with each noise, and rows of teeth flashed like a warning. Then it vanished into the earth. I was dumbfounded. It wasn't until I found my way back to the woodline that I realized I had urinated on myself. The search party was nearing the end of their section, but I couldn't say a word. My tongue felt like concrete. Now submerged in the cushion of my passenger seat, the air conditioning blowing full force on my pale, sweaty face. I can't decide on what to do. My mind is at an impasse. Should I sound like a mental patient and detail my encounter to the father and search party? Or should I keep it to myself, cast it off as a hallucination, and leave the father his hope and wishful thinking?